Galatians chapter 2, verse 1. Then, after 14 years, I again went up to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along too. This pair right here, well, Paul, pretty much, Paul and Barnabas, they several times represented two witnesses. Then it was Titus also going along. But Barnabas represents Eliyahu for several reasons. Son of rest. Right? Bar is son. Naba pretty much rest. But as you see here, Navi is prophet. So it pretty much, and once again, the concordance doesn't give us the Nava for rest, instead gives us Navi. So in that case, the name would be Barnavi, which would mean the son of the prophet. So they are both, there's also a Naba in Hebrew that deals with rest or has to do or connects with the word rest. But my point is that they are both prophetical. And when we see it as the son of the prophet, as we know, the last is the prophet. In John 1, Eliyahu was asked, John the Baptist was asked if he was the Messiah, if he was Eliyahu, or if he was the prophet. So there were three people that had to come according to prophecies that they were expecting. Mashiach is Yahushua, Eliyahu was John the Baptist, Yahuchanan. So then we have the prophet who still needs to appear. The prophet is the witness like Moshe, represented by Shaul. That's why I said Shaul and Barnavi represented two witnesses, because Shaul would represent the prophet and Barnavi would be his spiritual son, therefore the son of the prophet. I hope that's understood. So that's why Shaul and Barnavi, when they would go together and they appear together in scripture, they normally represented two witnesses. And also the last brings the rest of the Shabbat. That's why he comes at the end, right before the Shabbat begins. So the son of rest also deals with the last who brings the rest, who has Eliyahu as his spiritual son. So the son of the rest. Just like as well, Noah means rest. And Yahushua said that the days of the Son of Man would be like the days of Noah. So the Son of Man is like Noah, because he brings rest to the world. Then after 14 years, numerical value of David, the king, I again went up to Jerusalem with Barnavi, taking Titus along too. And I went up by revelation and laid before them that good news which I proclaim among the nations, but separately to those who were esteemed, lest somehow I run or had run in vain. So, and I went up by revelation and laid before them that good news which I proclaim among the nations. So he went and pretty much explained to them what he was preaching, what he was telling everybody among the nations, but separately to those who were esteemed, lest somehow I run or had run in vain. And I went out by revelation and laid before them that good news which I proclaim among the nations, but separately to those who were esteemed, honored, lest somehow I run or had run in vain. Right? So one of the ways, and we can see this, how he would speak to those who were honored. Well, some were honored by the people, and therefore they would have issues with the true doctrine, because once again they were pleasing the people. Others honored by Yahweh, meaning those who are the apostles, the emissaries, honored by Mashiach, they would be listening to the good news that Paul was teaching. And like he says, let's somehow I run or had run in vain. So he wanted to know that it was according to, like checking. I am preaching this. Are we all in the same mind? Are we all in the same ruach? because if not, I ran in vain all over the place teaching something that wasn't right. So, and also interesting, separately to those who were esteemed, because like for instance, when if a teacher is explaining something, a disciple or a student, if he has issues with it, he should come, or if he has let me see, information different than what the teacher is giving, of course he can raise his hand and ask, but all should be done with respect and for the good of the congregation. So in this case, that's why Shaul would do it separately, to get to the truth of any matter, so that nothing would confuse the listeners, the people, the congregation. So it is also a matter of order and respect. But separately to those who were esteemed, lest somehow I run or had run in vain. But not even Titus, who was with me, though a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. This is important. But not even Titus, who was with me, though a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. Even though he was a Greek, he wasn't compelled to be circumcised. But as for the false brothers sneakingly brought in, who sneaked in to spy out our sorry, but as for the false brothers sneakingly brought in, who sneaked in to spy out our freedom, which we have in Mashiach Yahushua, in order to slave us, to these we did not yield in subjection, not even for an hour, so that the truth of the good news remains with you. So we see that Paul didn't force Titus or Titus to be circumcised, to get the circumcision, even though he was a Gentile. But there were false brothers. And once again, they come up, like I mentioned, and we need to keep this in mind, because there will be people who will get into the congregation claiming to be brothers, and then they will go out showing themselves as having been spies. As it says here, sneaked in to spy out our freedom. The fact that Yahweh gave us freedom, but to them is blasphemy, heresy. And they get mad that we are free. They get mad that we are happy because they are not with all them chains. So this is important, because this has happened, and sadly it will happen again. But as for the false brothers sneakingly brought in, who sneaked in to spy out our freedom, which we have in Mashiach Yahushua, in order to enslave us. That's what they want. They want to enslave us with doctrines of men. They want to enslave us with the interpretations, the personal interpretations that they have of life and of scriptures. They want to enslave us because they are enslaved in their minds, in their hearts. To these, we did not yield in subjection, right? They didn't accept or became subjects to those lies that they were being taught as if they were from Mashiach. Not even for an hour. Imagine. Some minutes were too much. It was like, not even an hour will I hear this fallacy. So that the truth of the good news remains with you. But from those who were esteemed to be whatever, what they were, it makes no difference to me. Elohim shows no partiality. Yahweh shows no partiality. For those who were esteemed contributed not to me. They did nothing for him. And that's why I was mentioning those who are esteemed by the people. They may not be necessarily esteemed by Yahweh. And that's what people normally don't understand or see. They tend to judge Yahweh as the enemy, pretty much. They think that Yahweh is like them, that Yahweh thinks like they do. And scripture tells us the opposite. My thoughts are not your thoughts, Yahweh said. So Yahweh shows no partiality. So why would Paul show any partiality towards the people or those who were esteemed, honored? He did what I mentioned of speaking to them separately for a matter of respect and order, not for partiality. But as he says here, but from those who are esteemed to be whatever, however they esteem them, whatever they think of them, what they were, it makes no difference to me. And that's how it should be for us as well. Whatever they claim to be, whatever the people see them as, shouldn't mean anything to us. Just like it shouldn't mean anything to us if a person doesn't have any titles, any knowledge, any understanding yet. If he has been in sin but wants to repent, shouldn't be different from a person who has money and claims he wants to know the truth. Right? People sadly will tend to seek the one with money and the other one leave it on the side because of the looks, because of the past, or whatever. Not knowing what the one with money has done or does in private. So, but from those who were esteemed to be whatever, what they were, it makes no difference to me. Yahweh shows no partiality, for those who were esteemed contributed not to me. So no matter how esteemed they were, they didn't do anything to help the good news or to help Paul do what he was doing. He received help from people, from the congregation, not all the congregation, certain parts of the congregation, as he himself explains in other letters. On the contrary, when they saw that the good news to the uncircumcised had been entrusted to me, even as Keph to the circumcised, and that doesn't mean that Keph was sent to circumcise people. No, he was sent to the circumcised, those who were of the letter, who followed the Torah according to the letter. Shaul went to the uncircumcised, those who had no Torah, but were seeking the truth. So, just like first and last, Keph and Shaul. But on the contrary, when they saw that the good news to the uncircumcised had been entrusted to me, even as Keph to the uncircumcised, I can mention Shaul to the nations, Keph to the Yahudim. For he who worked in Keph to make him an emissary to the circumcised also worked in me for the nations, the same mighty one. Yet they remained stuck in the flesh to the point that they would see them differently, because one was speaking to circumcised people and the other one was speaking to uncircumcised people, when it was all a matter of flesh, a little piece of skin. So for he who worked in Keph to make him an emissary to the circumcised also worked in me for the nations. And imagine 2,000 years, like they had Keph and Shaul present at the same time. They could speak to both. Yet, well, nowadays, when the last would manifest, pretty much 2,000 years from the first, the generations have come and gone, and now the last generation is on earth, and they will see the two witnesses, and they won't be able to see any connection because they are of the world and of the false doctrine. So they won't see any connection between Yahushua and the last. They will say, oh, they're completely different. How can you make any connection or think that he, the last, is speaking of the Messiah? Look at him, listen to him, whatever. Because of all the changes that the enemy has made throughout the years, in 2,000 years, in doctrine and the world and the mindset of society and all of that. And my point is, in his time, Paul is already saying that they had issues with them or with him because he was talking to the uncircumcised, while Keph to the circumcised. For he who worked in Keph to make him an emissary to the circumcised also worked in me for the nations. He's the same mighty one. And he sent both, even though they were going to different, very, very different people with very, very different cultures. But they were both sent by the same one. Just like Yahuhanan and Mercer and Yahushua. Yahushua said, Yahuhanan didn't eat, he didn't drink, he didn't do anything. Yet everybody said he was possessed by a demon. The Son of Man comes drinking and eating, and they say that he is a drunk and well, all the evil things that they said. So they are never happy. Yahweh sent both John the Baptist and Yahushua, very different from each other. This didn't do anything. This did everything in freedom and in truth and correctly and in justice, of course. But I mean, he would drink wine, right? So to some people that was evil because they had issues with wine. So they would see John the Baptist and see him not eating anything, doing anything, only those crickets with honey, and they would say he has a demon. So society, the enemy, will keep them always unhappy. And when they judge Yahweh from their own perspective, putting him in a little box according to their own experience in life, they end up rejecting those whom he sent, as they did with all the prophets. So it is the same mighty one who sent Mashiach and Eliyahu, John the Baptist, the same mighty one who sends the first and the last. But people don't see any connection and find anything possible to reject. For he who worked in Keph to make him an emissary to the circumcised also worked in me for the nation. When Yaakov, Keph, and Yahuhanan, who seemed to be supports, came to know the favor that had been given to me, they gave me and Barnaby the right hand of fellowship, in order that we go to the nations and they to the circumcised. So Shaul is saying they spoke with me, they knew about it, and they agreed. And we were fine. Yet others complaining. Others who did not know Mashiach and did not know the revelation were complaining about what Shaul was doing. Just like others were complaining about what Keph was doing. The point is, there will always be complainers. Only that we might remember the poor, which I myself was eager to do. So he had no issue with it. He already knew about it. And that shows something great from the apostles themselves. Only that we might remember the poor. And so must we. So, verse 11. And when Keph had come to Antioch, I withstood him to his face, because he was at fault. It's also interesting how when Keph had an issue, Shaul had no issue with making him know it. Right? People would be afraid of it because Keph was so close to Yahushua and was given the good news to be brought to the Yahudim from Yahushua. So a lot of people would not dare to say anything to Keph. But Shaul wasn't there to please men. He was there to please Yahweh. So when he saw that Keph did something wrong, he told him to his face. Obviously, with love, right? Not with disrespect or anything like that. And when Keph had come to Antioch, I withstood him to his face because he was at fault. For before some came from Yaakov, he was eating with the nations. But when they came, he began to withdraw and separate himself in fear of those of the circumcision. Right? So he was being a hypocrite. And this is also, I think, important to understand, to put ourselves in Peter's sandals as well, also in Shaul's, because in Acts 10 we see how Yahweh told Peter, Keph, to accept the Gentiles. So that's why he was eating with them, right? But when some Yahudim came with Yaakov, all of a sudden Keph was trying to stay away from the Gentiles, not to offend the Yahudim. So since sadly he was a very, well, not sadly, it's part of him, but that led him to make several mistakes. Keph was very emotional. So in a way, I can understand, because of his emotions, that he did not want to hurt the emotions of the Yahudim. And in a way, we can even talk about how Paul speaks about how we should be careful with those who are of weak faith in Romans 14. So we could say in a way that Peter was trying to be careful with the Yahudim who had a weak faith and would perhaps had issues if they didn't understand why Peter was eating with Gentiles. However, we're talking about Gentiles who were believers. And perhaps he didn't think about the emotions of the Gentiles that much, and that is the issue there, because he was being partial. He had partiality, which Yahweh doesn't. As if the Yahudim were the rich and the Gentiles were the poor. And when the rich came, he went with the rich, right? They were rich in knowledge, in Torah, but they didn't use it well because they didn't understand the letter. Just like those who are rich and don't use their wealth correctly. For before some came from Yaakov, he was eating with the nations. But when they came, he began to withdraw and separate himself in fear of those of the circumcision. Fear of those of the circumcision, not fear of Yahweh, not fear of whatever, but of those of the circumcision. And the rest of the Yahudim joined him in hypocrisy. So since Peter, Keph, was their leader, when they saw Keph acting this way, they started doing the same. And that's how bad behavior spreads easily. And the rest of the Yahudim joined him in hypocrisy, so that even Barnavi was led away by their hypocrisy. Barnavi, who was the one with Paul, the one with Shaul, all of a sudden was kind of doing the same as Peter. Which is interesting because, like I mentioned, Barnavi represents Eliyahu. And Eliyahu, when he came as John the Baptist, was more of the letter. He was of the time of the flesh. So it is interesting that Barnavi led himself by the flesh in this occasion, trying to please those of the letter, those of the circumcision. But when I saw that they are not walking straight according to the truth of the good news, I said to Keph before them all, if you, being a Yahudi, live as the nations and not as the Yahudim, why do you compel nations to live as Yahudim? So he pretty much exposed them, right? It's like, why are you eating with them? Like you were eating with them as well, with the nations. Right. But when I saw that they are not walking straight according to the truth of the good news, when he realized that they were not doing what Yahushua told us, to love our neighbor as ourselves, because they were not loving the nations the same. It says, I said to Kepha before them all, if you, being a Yahudi, live as the nations, this is interesting, live as the nations. To the Yahudim, those who believe in Mashiach and were freed of the letter, were just like the nations. Obviously, they were not pagans, but they were free of the commandments of men. So that's why Shaul puts it this way. If you, being a Yahudi, live as the nations and not as the Yahudim, why do you compel nations to live as Yahudim? Right? As to ask those of the nations to get the circumcision. We, Yahudim by nature, and not of the nations, Sinners, knowing that a man is not declared right by works of Torah. This is wonderful, super important. And also, Shaul was using this moment of correction for teaching, which is how every correction should be. But my point is not only to correct Peter, but to teach everybody there and those people of the Yahudim, of the circumcision, who did not understand still reason why Peter went with them. We Yahudim by nature and not of the nations, sinners, knowing that a man is not declared right by works of Torah, which is pretty much how they want to be declared right. But the Torah itself says that it is impossible. But through belief in Yahushua the Messiah, even we have believed in Mashiach Yahushua, in order to be declared right by belief in Messiah and not by works of Torah, in order to be declared righteous, right? Justified by belief in Messiah and not by works of Torah. Because by works of Torah, no flesh shall be declared right. By works of Torah, no flesh shall be declared righteous. And if we, while seeking to be declared righteous by Messiah, we ourselves also are found sinners, is Messiah then a servant of sin? Let it not be. For if I revealed what I once overthrew, I establish myself a transgressor. Right? Like Peter had thrown away those false doctrines of the Yahudim, but he was kind of starting to build it back up. So Paul had to stop him and say, no, don't do it, because you'll become a transgressor. How can you go back to the sins that you rejected, that you repented of? For if I reveal what I once overthrew, I establish myself a transgressor. So if I reveal what I once overthrew, I establish myself a transgressor. For through Torah, I died to Torah in order to live to Yahweh. Another wonderful verse. For through Torah, I died to Torah, as we see in Romans 7. The Torah is the one that kills us, pretty much, because the Torah is the one that says the wages of sin is death. And Paul already said here, we are sinners. So through Torah, we died. And by dying, we died to the Torah in order to live to Elohim through the resurrection of Yahushua. For through Torah, I died to Torah in order to live to Yahweh. I have been impaled with Mashiach, and I no longer live, but Messiah lives in me. And that which I now live in the flesh, I live by belief in the Son of Yahweh, who loved me and gave himself for me. How wonderful. And I cannot imagine the shame in Keph's face when he was hearing all of this. Like, oof, how can I hear this from somebody who didn't walk with Mashiach? I have been impaled with Mashiach, and I no longer live, but Mashiach lives in me. Once again, what I was saying regarding first and last, there's one. The last sent us Mashiach, so Mashiach is in him. And that which I now live in the flesh, I live by believing the Son of Yahweh, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not set aside the favor of Yahweh, for if righteousness is through Torah, then Messiah died for naught. So, like a spiritual slap in the face. And that had to make everybody think. For if righteousness is through Torah, then Messiah died for nothing. And then why are so many people claiming to believe in the Messiah, in his work, but they are still trying to get enslaved by the Torah, according to the letter is what I mean, of course, right? The commandments of men. I do not set aside the favor of Yahweh, neither should we. Never in the life. Never in life should we set aside the favor and then be like, I want the chains. So I do not set aside the favor of Yahweh, for if righteousness is through Torah, then Mashiach died for it not. So an amazing chapter, very important one for us to really study or examine ourselves to see if we are being like Keph or if we are understanding the good news like Shaul, or even worse, if somebody is like those Yehudim whom Peter was trying to please, who are still trying to find righteousness through the Torah.